Hey everyone, it's good to be back with you on this Thursday. I hope you're all doing well and staying safe and healthy. We're going to pick back up where we left off yesterday in our Bible study. And in this study, we're walking through Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount. And today and yesterday, we are looking at his words in Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 26, where he talks about what do we do in the context of dealing with broken relationships and fractured relationships and dealing with our anger, and how do we live with a righteousness from the inside out, not just dealing with external behaviors, not just dealing with our actions on the outside, but how do we deal with transformation and moving things forward from the inside out in our lives. And so part of what we talked about yesterday was the target. What's the target that we're aiming for? That Jesus in this passage talks about how the target is not just murder, the target's not just being angry or not just insulting, but the target that we're working toward is reconciliation and restoration. And so to that end, I want to give you a couple of takeaways as to why it's important for you and me to pursue a righteousness from the heart when it comes to those broken relationships in our lives with others and properly dealing with our anger. And the first is this: when we pursue a righteousness from the heart, the do nots of behavior become less of a concern. Yesterday we talked about how it's easy to focus on don't do this and don't do that, when in the end we end up doing just what we're telling ourselves not to do. But when we focus and pursue a righteousness from the heart, the do nots become less of a concern. Let me give you an example. Let's say Marcy and I and the kids are going to get on a plane. We buy a ticket or tickets, and we head down to Atlanta, where my parents live. We don't want to drive down there. We want to fly down there, so we buy tickets to head down to Atlanta. And when we get off the plane, we can assume that my parents are not going to greet us and say, "We are so glad that you didn't end up in New York or Los Angeles." Why? Well, because when we bought a ticket to go to Atlanta, the assumption is that that's where we're going to end up. We took steps to get to Atlanta, and that made some other decisions for us. There were other destinations that we weren't going to end up at because our destination. We took steps to get to Atlanta. When you and I set our hearts on the target of reconciliation, and we get on a path towards that end, it makes some other decisions for us in terms of where we're not going to end up. We're going to be less inclined to end up at taking someone's life. We're going to be less inclined to end up at staying perpetually angry for weeks and months and even years. We're going to be less inclined to end up at insulting and labeling. On the flip side, if I want to go to Atlanta, then simply focusing on not going to New York or LA isn't necessarily going to get me to Atlanta. I've got to aim for Atlanta, and I've got to get on a path that takes me to there. Simply focusing on not murdering or not being angry or not insulting or not labeling isn't going to get us to the destination of reconciliation. If not murdering is our target, then we can still be angry. We can still hate. We can still insult. We can still curse. We can even still end up at the destination, believe it or not, that we thought we never really could. Never could imagine being there. I heard a story about a couple of guys in a town in South Alabama. These two guys, they were grown men. They got into a fight outside of an apartment complex, and the fight stemmed from an argument over what a particular Bible verse meant. One of them got so frustrated that he went into his apartment, took out a gun, and shot the guy and killed him over a Bible verse. Last year in the U.S., there were over 16,000 murders. And last time I checked, it's still against the law to murder. And so we're telling people not to murder, but there's still over 16,000 murders. But curbing the murder rate is going to take more than just some restraint on the outside, because telling people not to murder is the wrong target. It's going to take transformation in people's hearts from the inside. And ultimately, Jesus isn't just out to curb the murder rate or even to keep people from being angry with one another or to keep people from cursing one another. He's out to restore what's been broken. That's the target. And we can obey the commandment of not murdering all the while still holding on to our anger. But it's pretty tough to pursue reconciliation and restoration while still holding on to our anger. That's why restoration and reconciliation have to be the target. And when that's the target, the do nots become less of a concern. And then secondly, when we pursue a righteousness from the heart, anger becomes a servant rather than a master in our lives. Jesus tells us, he says, I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. In essence, he's saying, I want you to give some thought. I want you to give the same amount of attention to the anger in your heart that you would to murder. Why? Well, because violent words and actions are rooted in the soil of an angry heart. And just go back to the very first murder in the Bible. It happened between two brothers as well, Cain and Abel. But do you remember the question that God asked Cain prior to the murder? In Genesis chapter 4, verse 6, it says, Then the Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry? The story of the very first murder began because of one brother's difficulty processing anger in his own heart. And so Jesus is helping us to understand that we're not going to transform the exterior of our lives simply by restraining from breaking these external laws and commands. That ultimately it's got to be through attacking things that are on the inside of our hearts. And all too often, anger winds up becoming our master and taking over our lives instead of us having control over it. Now, the reality is that anger is a natural physiological response. And let me say that I do think that there are times when that initial physiological response of anger can be a catalyst to move us in a forward direction where we face the issue and we move toward resolution, whether that be in our own lives or in a broken relationship, or maybe even how we reach out to a lost and dying world and seeing injustices in our world and taking action and rectifying those things and bringing restoration in those things. But let me also say that anger shouldn't stay as the motivating factor in our lives. It can be something that initially moves us to action, but anger should never be our motivating factor. Because as we've talked about, anger is something that we have to be very, very careful with, especially when we try to justify our anger in regards to God's anger. Now, we don't have time to get into all of that today because that's a lesson or maybe even two in and of itself. But let me just say that God is God and you and I are not. And his anger is a justified anger. But when the Bible talks about our anger, it's not always in a positive light. As James says in James 1, everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger doesn't bring about the righteous life that God desires. Of course, we also read in verses like Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26, where it says, In your anger, do not sin. And so we say, see, I can be angry, I can't sin in my anger. But listen to the very next verse that Paul gives, the very next words that Paul gives. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. In essence, Paul says, don't let anger be your master. You master it. Don't hold on to it, but get rid of it and move beyond it, because anger in our hearts is the devil's playground. Don't bury the issue in a bottle or in a drug. Don't deny the issue or let it swell up inside of you, but face the issue of what's been done and turn your anger into something that moves you forward toward resolution and healing. And so while physiologically the response of anger can be a catalyst that moves us forward, it should never be our motivating factor. And yet so often, far too many people don't move forward to a resolution out of their anger, but rather they suppress their anger, they indulge in it, they stew over it. Medical experts say that a steady diet of anger in our lives can be related to as many as 20 different physical maladies, including but not limited to headaches, stomach problems, immunity deficiencies, colds, colitis, skin problems, high blood pressure, depression, heart attacks, and strokes. In fact, studies show that at least 85% of all diseases have a strong link to your emotional state. And some believe that number to even be higher than that. And for some people who don't know how to process their anger, they live their lives for years and years angry. but never truly dealing with it, denying it, suppressing it, burying it, but eventually physiologically it takes its toll. Makes me think of what Job said in Job 28 Job 5 verse 2 when he said, resentment kills a fool. And physiologically, it can. Job 18 verse 4 says, you tear yourself to pieces in your anger. The bottom line is that when anger becomes our master, we're not just in a position to tear other people down, we're actually in a position to tear ourselves down as well. But when we pursue a righteousness from the heart, we are going on the offensive with our anger. We're paying attention to it and to what's happening to us on the inside. It reminds me of the story of the mom who was at the grocery store with her young daughter, and the daughter had just been a train wreck at the grocery store, crying, whining, pulling stuff off the shelves. Maybe some of you can relate. Eventually the mom she got her grocery shopping done, and she got in line to check out, and the woman who was in front of her actually kind of crossed paths with her several times as she was in the grocery store and had seen some of the child's behavior up to this point. And while they were in line, she saw the mom, and she overheard her saying, okay, Katie, we're almost done. Just hang in there, calm down. It's gonna be okay. We're gonna be out of here in just a few minutes. We can make it through this. And so the lady turned around and she said to her mother, to the mother, she's listening to her, said, I want to let you know how impressed I am that how you talk so calmly to your little girl and you didn't get upset with her. Little Katie is so lucky to have you as a mom. And the mother said, oh, thank you. But my little girl's name is Susie. My name is Katie. And while there's some humor in that story, maybe there's also something to be learned. Because at least that mother is paying attention to what's going on the inside. And that's a lot of what Jesus is getting at. Pay attention to what's going on the inside of us, because it starts there. Cain winds up killing his brother Abel, but it started with the anger in his heart. And so it is with us. And so Jesus comes along and he says, here's the life I want to give you. Here's the life that I want you to live. But the only way to truly live life on the outside, that kind of life on the outside, is by allowing my righteousness to go deep on the inside of your heart. And any plan for living life has to factor in a time when when we've got to learn how to live and how to act when it comes to those broken relationships in our lives. Because all of us are going to walk through those at some point or another. And Jesus says there's a way forward. But here's the deal. It's not going to bypass your heart. Because God doesn't do heart bypasses. God does heart transplants. He wants our hearts in on the action because we live from our hearts, for better and for worse. And that's why his best work is always an inside job. Hope you have a blessed day. God bless.